We may begin the program.
Good day. I'm Robbie van Niekerk, a friend, colleague, and comrade of Vishnu. It's an immense honor to chair this memorial event in honor of our very dearly beloved and departed Vishnu. I'd firstly like to extend my very deepest condolences to the family, friends, and the colleagues and comrades of our much loved my Vishnu Padayachee, or Vishnu as he was known to everyone. I want to also extend a very warm welcome and thank you to everyone who joined this commemoration event in honor of Vishnu, both in South Africa and beyond its borders. The commemoration event is organized by Wits University through the Office of the Dean of Commerce Law and Management. In thinking through today's program, it was inescapably clear that to be a full testimony to Vishnu, a small group of speakers would just not suffice, given the extent, breadth, and depth of his academic, personal, political, and professional reach in both South Africa and abroad. We apologize for the somewhat lengthy, but you may agree necessary program under the sad circumstances we find ourselves in. Vishnu very unexpectedly passed away after battling serious kidney-related illness a week ago. The night before he died, I received a communication from Vishnu that he expected to be discharged from hospital tomorrow. Most tragically, it was not to be. I'd like to make mention and express gratitude here to Dr. Rajan Pillai, Vishnu's close cousin, whose timely interventions as a medical doctor assisted in preserving Vishnu's life on 2 occasions. The immense outpourings of grief and heartfelt tributes since the news of Vishnu's death be poignant testimony to the significance of Vishnu's impact and how much he was deeply loved. He was renowned as a world-class scholar of heterodox economics with a particular and personal academic interest in Keynes. He also enjoyed an immense reputation as an informed intellectual, engaged in developing and evaluating progressive macroeconomic policies and strategies. He was also well known in the politics of Durban since the 1970s as a socialist-inspired political activist and educator committed to fundamental but democratic social change. In addition, he worked as a highly respected senior public servant in a democratic South Africa, in particular in his role on the board of the South African Reserve Bank. Not least, he had a formidable reputation as a knowledgeable book lover and collector, and who played a seminal role in helping the literary world of Durban flourish through the iconic Ike's bookshop. He was, in addition to all these, an informed expert sports enthusiast with a particular love for cricket and football. The song you heard in the introduction was Dreams by Fleetwood Mac, one of Vishnu's favorite songs and so appropriate for this gathering today, because Vishnu was a man of dreams, of big dreams. Underpinning and binding all these elements of his life of immense consequence was a deep and affecting humanism, a love of people, in particular his friends and comrades and family, and a genuine and empathetic interest in their worlds. Whether a driver of a taxi, a student, an activist in the trade union movement, an office worker, as for example in the legal firm of Maynard Governor in Durban, we happily spent time working and chatting to the staff, or the head of a major government institution, all were treated unequivocally and always with not only equal respect, but also a genuine personal interest and concerned curiosity. That was the measure and depth of the man and scholar, and what made him special and loved, his incredible warmth and humanity, and absence of any cynicism in the manner in which he related to other human beings. Today, we will commemorate a beloved man and bear testimony through his family, friends, academic colleagues, students, and comrades to all these facets of his life. We have lined up a range of speakers, and I'd like to commence with our Vice Chancellor Zebulon Vilakazi. Unfortunately, Professor Vilakazi can't be with us here in person, but he has prepared a video which we will now present and then we will continue with the rest of the program of 9 speakers. Thank you. If we could have the video, please, of the Vice Chancellor.
Good afternoon, colleagues, friends, and family members of Professor Vishnu Padayachee. It's always difficult to say goodbye to a colleague, a friend, and a respected scholar, in particular, the loved one, for those that have lost Professor Padayachee, who were part of his extended circle of family and friends. We are all here today to celebrate the life and work of Vishnu. Indeed, celebrate the rich legacy that he has left in his wake. He may be gone, but his contributions to the academy, our economy, our country, and the world at large will remain and endure for decades to come. In 2018, Wits University recognized Professor Padayachee with the award of an honorary doctorate for, I quote, exceptionally distinguished contribution to the post-apartheid transformation of economic policy. He is renowned mostly for his work in economic policy and economic history. Even the latter I have a special interest in as well, as an armchair historian. But Professor Padayachee's teaching and research area not only did it influence our thinking around policy in this country, but also shaped many minds, including the current dean of the Faculty of Commerce, Law and Management, and my predecessor, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Wits, who now is the director of the School of Oriental and African Studies, who's also will say a few words about his comrade and mentee. His academic work has reverberated throughout the world. He held appointments at Oxford, Johns Hopkins University, Cambridge, and many others. Prof. Padayachee was a thinker, an intellectual, and a serious academic of rigor par excellence. He joined Wits as a distinguished professor and held the Derek Schrier and Cecily Cameron Chair in Economics when he joined Wits since 2014. He played an instrumental role in developing the applied developed economics postgraduate program and contributed hugely to the development of the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits. It is through our membership of the board of the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits that I got to interact with Professor Padayachee at a very close range. I was inspired and impressed by his sharp and incisive thinking, his understanding of the complexities of economics, which is an area of which I learned a lot from how you could analyze, understand, and influence the trajectory that this fledgling center was going to take. I was richly impressed by his richness and understanding of complexity. In that regard, I did benefit and learn a lot during our interactions. Of course, there is still a lot of unfinished work. Professor Padayachee left us too soon. He was still, I would say, a young man, but the amount of time he has spent with this university, with his colleagues in the other universities he has worked at, and in this country, has been a journey well traveled. He has left an enduring legacy to this country, to the universities that he has worked with, and in the world. Hamba kahle, Prof. Vishnu, and we have walked the journey and left your mark on the sand of economic policy in this country and on this continent.
Sorry, I've unmuted there. That was our Vice Chancellor, and before I go on to present our next presenter, I just want to also make the point that in South Africa, we are experiencing a load shedding, which means that our power supply is cut off for determined periods. And in the current town I'm in at the moment, Makanda, we're exactly going through that process. So I'm reliant on sources of power beyond the normal electricity supply. And in the instance where the power fails or my communication signals failed, and Prof. Imran Valodia will take over proceedings. I'd now like to call on Uma Kolam-Parambal, the head of the School of Economics and Finance of the University of the Witwatersrand, where Vishnu held the position of Distinguished Professor in Economics and was a Derek Schrier and Cecily Cameron Chair in Development Economics, to say a few words on behalf of the school. Uma.
Thank you, Robbie, and good afternoon, everybody. I am Uma Kolam-Parambal, the head of Economics and Finance, where Vishnu Padayachee held the positions of Distinguished Professor and the Derek Schrier and Cecily Cameron Chair in Development Economics. As much as I would like to claim Vishnu's affiliation entirely for our school, he was also holding various other prestigious positions at the time of his death, including Professor Emeritus and Lifetime Fellow at UKZN, Fellow at Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies, and Lifetime Fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Vishnu was truly larger than life. And I'm speaking on behalf of my colleagues and the school when I say that we are still reeling from the shock of losing our much revered and beloved colleague. Vishnu joined our school, then known as SEBS, School of Economics and Business Sciences, in 2014. He led a team of economists to develop our heterodox economics program. We call it Applied Development Economics, which ran from third year undergrad honors all the way to master's and PhD program. He was also actively involved in teaching the macroeconomics module within the program. He was supervising PhD students, and as recently as last month, he took on a new student to supervise. He was co-authoring with colleagues in the school and mentoring many more outside of any formal arrangements. We have lost our star researcher who dominated the school research output by heads and shoulders. And he has inspired us through his commitment to academics as well as social justice. Unlike many here, I cannot claim the honor of having known Vishnu closely for a very long period of time. I've interacted closely with Vishnu only for the last couple of years in my capacity of head of economics initially, and now the head of school. But then it didn't take a very long time for Vishnu to leave a mark on anybody. And he has indeed left a deep and lasting personal impact on me, and foremost through his commitment to work and his work ethics. And I can't describe it in any other way other than fierce. He was fiercely passionate about his research and work. This was evident till the very end, when he was working on book projects and papers, even from the hospital. Yanni Rousseau tells me that they had extensive discussions on their latest paper on monetary policy history on the Friday afternoon. And Saturday morning, we heard the news of his passing. He was an intellectual giant, and his commitment to research and social justice will no doubt be spoken at length today by people who collaborated with him closely. What I wish to share are two memories that stand out for me, which shows the facets of a man that truly made him different from others. The first is from June 2020. The country was under lockdown level 3. The school was operating on emergency remote teaching mode. And Vishnu sends me an email request to approve his travel arrangements from Durban to Johannesburg to teach the students. I initially very lightly responded saying that would not be necessary, as he could teach remotely. Vishnu was persistent. He got back saying he wishes to travel, reassuring me that he would teach the students outdoors under the tree, which he felt would be adequate protection. Such was his commitment to his students. I had to, of course, err on the side of caution and stand my ground and turn down his request once again. And I must say that ultimately Vishnu accepted my decision very graciously. His commitment to teaching and research apart, what stood out for me is also Vishnu's humility. There's a particular incident I would like to recall. In January 2020, before the pandemic changed our worlds, Vishnu approached the school for moving his office closer to the elevator because of his difficulty to walk long distance. For all the academics here, I don't have to remind you how territorial we are about our office space. Therefore, getting an academic to vacate a long occupied room to accommodate Vishnu was very difficult. And the only available room at short notice was a windowless, small office near the elevator. The room was so small, it could just about squeeze in the furniture from Vishnu's previous spacious office. And when the day came for Vishnu to see his new office, I braced myself. I made sure I was there personally, along with our ops manager, prepared with my most charming speech and long list of promises to cajole Vishnu, with the plans to refurnish and restructure the room. But Vishnu's reaction threw me completely off balance. To my utter astonishment, and I must say huge relief, Vishnu was not just satisfied, but totally happy and grateful for his new space. I cannot imagine a single other academic, myself included, who would react in that way to a 8 feet by 8 feet windowless cubicle. The lesson he taught me that day was that big names don't have to come with big egos. That day I was convinced that we have a lot to learn from him other than from his writings. At a more personal level, Vishnu was never too busy to provide words of support and encouragement to me personally as a new head of school. Every time there was a need, I could pick up the phone, talk to him, and he always had advice and guidance. I'm sure he did the same for others in the school, especially those working within the heterodox program. The last I spoke to Vishnu was in March 2020. He had big plans for the future. He spoke about his recent book, Shadow of Liberation. He was very happy that its 2020 December launch in Durban was attended by the maximum number of people allowed by lockdown restriction. He was working on new book projects and papers. He had so much more to write, teach, and share. He has left us much too early. But he has left us with a rich legacy through his writings, his students, and his co-authors, who will no doubt take Vishnu's work forward. Go well, Vishnu. You will be missed. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Thank you.
Thank you for those words, Uma. Family meant everything to Vishnu, and his extended family was very, very important in shaping his life and his values and what he came to represent. So we are privileged to have Trevi Padayachee with us this afternoon. Trevi is Vishnu's cousin on both sides of the family. He's the youngest of the Padayachee cousins of Vishnu and will speak from that perspective on behalf of the Padayachee family. Trevi.
Thank you, Robbie. Good afternoon, dear colleagues and friends of my dear cousin Vishnu. I am honored to have been asked to speak at this memorial on behalf of the family, and especially honored to be in the company of such esteemed academics. I would at the outset, on behalf of our family, like to thank all of you for your amazing tributes and your words of condolences and comfort to the family during this difficult period. It is especially comforting to know that he had such caring friends and colleagues, and all of you meant a great deal to him. As Robbie said, I am Vishnu's younger cousin. Our late dads were brothers and our mums are sisters. For most of our childhood years, we all lived in close proximity to each other in Amkomas. That was the homes of the three Padayachee brothers and our grandparents' home and temple near the middle. We virtually spilled into each other's homes, often congregating at the temple for prayers or a casual game of cricket. Many relatives who did not reside in Amkomas often spent weekends and school holidays there. Vishnu, being the older cousin, was in effect the leader of the band. He was the captain of the team, a role that he relished. We all looked up to him. We were indeed privileged to have him as our role model. I would like to share some memories of Vishnu with you, which I hope will reveal the human side of that gentle and distinguished soul. As an example of his leadership and vision, Vishnu converted my grandfather's fruit store into a games room, with table tennis at the front and darts and carom board at the back, and the walls adorned with stunning pictures of sportsmen of the day, the likes of Bjorn Borg, Muhammad Ali, Emerson Fittipaldi, and Viv Richards, to name a few. In fact, this games room was a meeting point for family and friends on Saturday afternoon, all thanks to Vishnu. My sister Satya was very close to him and would often accompany him on rides in his beloved BMW. In fact, someone once asked me if she was his fiancée. In fact, Satya entered UDW to study pharmacy, but she started with the Big Four, which most people discourage her from doing. But Vishnu was her strongest supporter. And being already familiar with UDW, I'm sure it was a great comfort to Satya. To us cousins, Vishnu was a great source of information, as he was to many of you and countless students and scholars. He had a great general knowledge, but we did not learn economics from him. We learned about the exciting things that make life interesting: music, sport, literature, and comedy. He passed on his great taste in music to many of us, me included. He introduced me to great artists like America, Poco, Fleetwood Mac, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. When I first heard Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run on one of his mixtapes, I was blown away. I recall once on a journey from Durban back to Amkomas, he made me listen to Bob Dylan's Hurricane, and then gave me a full lesson about the falsely convicted boxer Reuben Carter, on whom the song was based. So listening to music with Vishnu was an education in itself. Vishnu was knowledgeable in most sports, but as you mentioned, cricket was perhaps his favorite. We had many informal games around the temple, and we had many a broken window to show for it. We all had nicknames, based on cricketers of the day. And since Vishnu was a decent fast bowler, he was Vincent van der Bijl. I don't know if you remember this guy who played cricket for South Africa. And van der Bijl, the name quickly descended to Bijl, because if you remember, his name was spelled B-I-J-L. So Vishnu's nickname in cricket was Bijl. I remember Vishnu having this amazing Grundig radio, which had no less than 12 shortwave bands. And we used to listen to BBC Test Match special on that. Soon venues like Lord's, the Oval, Headingley, and Edgbaston became familiar to us. One thing I cannot forgive Vishnu for was influencing me to be a Tottenham Hotspur supporter. But I cherish the memory of watching with him the 1984 UEFA Cup final at Enver Motala's flat when Spurs beat Anderlecht. If and when I ever get to go to London again, I will visit their new stadium and leave a flower there in his honor. Even as a youngster, Vishnu was surrounded by books, not necessarily the great classics and collectibles that he became known for, but everything from Hardy Boys to Ian Fleming. And of course, some great magazines like Ring magazine and Wisden and Rolling Stones magazine. Some of you may be surprised to learn that one of his favorites was the American satirical comic Mad magazine, which soon became a favorite of all of our young cousins like myself. Speaking of books, when I turned 14, Vishnu bought me Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. And true to Vishnu's style, he inscribed in the book, "I wish I had read Kafka when I was 14. I was fortunate enough to live with Vishnu for 2 years at his flat in Silver Palm Road, Overport, the same building where Enver Motala lived. I actually ended up using the room that had recently been vacated by Rajain Mestri. I had just entered medical school and remember Vishnu once telling me that I was wasting my potential studying medicine. I took that as a compliment. I have great memories of our time at the flat, as do my sisters who also spent a lot of time there. I recall many of his academic friends like Professor Puvalan Pillai visiting us at the flat, and Vishnu would often get us to listen to Monty Python sketches. In fact, we listened to them so often that we knew so many of the sketches off word for word. As we all forged our own career paths, we sadly got to see less of each other, but Vishnu made a point keeping in touch with all of us. He regularly visited my aunt, who was in her 90s, and shared many stories with her. He also initiated the idea of a family reunion, which we duly had in Selborne around 2016. There's so many great memories of Vishnu for our family to cherish. We will remember him with great fondness. His loss is immeasurable. We are all better off and wiser for knowing him. I'd like to end by quoting the words of a great song by Dan Fogelberg, yet another musician that Vishnu introduced me to. Those words hold true for all members of our family and not just me. And so it goes. The leader of the band is tired and his eyes are growing old, but his blood runs through my instrument and his song is in my soul. My life has been a poor attempt to imitate the man. I'm just a living legacy to the leader of the band. I thank you once again for making us part of this wonderful memorial. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Trevi, for that very eloquent tribute to your dearly beloved cousin. Part of Vishnu's history stretches back to his time in Unkamas, and we're very happy that Rajain Mestri, very dear friend of Vishnu's, who's research chair in linguistics at UCT and formerly at the English Department of Durban Westville, who has a lifelong friendship with Vishnu, going back to the youth in Unkamas, can share some of his thoughts and feelings on his dear friend Vishnu. Rajain?
Vishnu's funeral was on Monday, the 31st of May, when he was cremated according to Hindu rites. That day was also his birthday. This was a source of sadness to us all, yet there's a certain fitting symmetry and balance. We might say in his end was his beginning. So let me dwell on those beginnings in my commemoration. I'd have to take you to the town of Amkamas, 40 kilometers down the coast from Durban, built on the south bank of KZN province's third largest river. Vishnu's family lived in a rural part called Roseneath, a name that speaks of earlier Scottish influence in an area amidst its Zulu majority. In Vishnu's family life, I detect 4 strands of influence which help us understand and appreciate the qualities of his adult life. First, there was his grandfather. Father Padayachee had gone to India and had been appalled at the poverty he witnessed, to return home to South Africa and to abandon the material world. He sold all the Padayachee possessions and began large-scale charitable work. He is credited by Vishnu by being one of the founders of the Divine Life Society. So here we see the notions of care and charity that would feed eventually into the grandson's work in developmental economics. Vishnu's father imbibed this ethos, obviously. He was a vegetarian all his life. When he was not teaching at school and later as a school principal, he spent almost all his time in community affairs and social work. Vishnu's mother, in the fashion of the time, was a keeper of the house and the religion and offered stability, much stability to Vishnu. His uncles next door, as we have heard from Trivi, were engaged in commerce. They worked and ran shops on behalf of Mr. C.S. Naidu, Vishnu's uncle, who was the leading entrepreneur in Amkamas in an otherwise impoverished area. These uncles, including Trivi's father, practiced commerce with ethics. So much so that one of them was not just the shopkeeper, but in fact the keeper of the local post office. The proper post office, the well-endowed one, was in the white village miles away, but for the local community, really a post box and a keeper of the post box was Vishnu's uncle. From other uncles, Vishnu learned perhaps his cosmopolitan outlook. It is sometimes said that Vishnu was something of a dapper, upper-class English gentleman in his younger days and even in his middle age. I'm not entirely sure about that, but he certainly had an uncle doing very well in England and another in Germany. From his local uncles, he learned cricket because no one else in Amkamas knew about cricket at the time. But to return to the point of the English gentleman, in fact, Vishnu carries a lot of his grandparents in him, of Father Padayachee, the man who renounced the material world. If you want evidence of this, Vishnu in fact spoke Tamil to both his grandparents till the age of 6, his ayah and grandfather, and he learned English from others. And after going to school after age 6, he stopped speaking Tamil. And I think that is certainly a great loss. The school that he went to was a local Naidu Memorial School, founded by a great uncle. He was a model pupil in a modest school with moderate facilities. Nevertheless, Vishnu was a popular prefect and head boy, fully immersed in school activities, even serving as goalkeeper and coach to students when they played the teachers. But the school had no cricket, no crosswords, no fine art as such, a library with not many books annexed to the kitchen, and no hint of politics. So where did Vishnu get all this from? I've mentioned the role of family members, but to some extent he was a self-made boy. In his high school days, Vishnu was allowed to take over the small tin house that had served as his grandfather's retreat. The family called it the Mardo, a Tamil word for monastery, really a large room for religious contemplation. For Vishnu, it was a secular den. I would venture to say that we need look no further for the roots of Ike's bookstore. The room, when I first visited in early 1972, had a large glass bookcase with a stock of old books, inherited probably from his uncles. The grandfather had sold all of his. Vishnu had posters on the wall and would occasionally try his hand at painting. I cannot say if he was a good painter, but the very fact of a young person seriously attempting fine art at home in Amkumas was remarkable. There were some old ornaments around from African and Indian cultures too. Vishnu wrote poetry, and while I later pleaded with him to preserve the slim notebook of poems, he firmly decided against it. I was lucky enough to travel with Vishnu to university for 2 years or so in a small blue Cortina driven by Chandra Venktes, a fellow BCom student of Vishnu's, with other passengers in the car, including Naren Singh and Perry Modley, all proudly Amkumas lads who didn't care to look for lodgings in Durban or had tried and found urban lodgings entirely contrary to their free rural spirit. A 2-hour journey each way forged lifelong friendships. Vishnu, with his ubiquitous morning newspaper and crosswords, initiating us all into the wonders of cricket, card games of Tani, talk of politics, and singing of "We Shall Overcome" after one set of campus boycotts early in my university career. Vishnu was, of course, the best UDW student of his cohort in commerce by a country mile. I can't help put it that way and use a rural metaphor. He was the only one to do honors, though he may have been joined by another candidate in the second year. He was not only one of the youngest lecturers at UDW from 1976 on, but soon became one of the most popular. This was due to the quality of his lectures and oratory and warm and easygoing nature, except when it came to grading essays and exams, when he was scrupulously fair and strict. With the staff, he played bridge. With the scientists, he played table tennis at lunchtime, and the entire drama department seemed to adore him on account of some close initial friendships. I shared a flat in Overport with Vishnu and his cousin Satya for 2 wonderful years in 1981 and 2, and I'd forgotten that my successor was Trivinesan Padayachee, later to be Dr. Padayachee. 2 floors above us was the Motala family, and Enver will, I think, take over this narrative later. I think I have taken up most of my time. Let me conclude briefly with a quotation. I started with Vishnu's end and beginnings. Let me end with the right quote from T.S. Eliot and a few further lines from 4 quartets. In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field or a factory or a bypass, old stone to new building, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to the earth. Rest in peace, dear Vishnu, beloved of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent. The formative period of Vishnu's political thought and activism was in the mid-1970s. And we have someone, a close friend of Vishnu's, to talk about some of this time and further observations he might have. It's Enver Mutala, who's the past director of the SACID Durban office and a senior educational policy specialist in the first post-apartheid education department in Gauteng, and also a socialist scholar and activist. He's a very close friend and comrade of Vishnu's of long standing. And in addition, if I may say so, Vishnu held Enver alongside iconic Durban activists AKM Dockrit and Ike Myatt as a most influential mentor. Enver.
Well, thanks very much, Ravi. I hope I can do justice to Vishnu's memory. I think there are many people here who knew him more intimately than me, but as you and Imran suggested, I might have something to say which will give a sense of what Vishnu's early formative years were. I met him in 1981. He came to live, as it were, next door with Rajen, and Jayesh, I think. But actually, there were 3 stories in the building, and we were 1 above him, not 2 above, as Rajen seems to suggest. I had just returned from Warwick, where the state debate and the debate about the South African political economy was absolutely the main item on the political and theoretical agenda. And there were many South Africans who were involved in it. At Warwick itself, there was Martin Legassic was there, Duncan Innes was there, I can't remember who else, and certainly Simon Clark. I came back to work for the Labour and Community Project in Sackhead, doing mainly education workshops for shop stewards and in political economy, working class and South African history, and of course the organizational question. So this obviously meant that Vishnu and I would develop a close relationship. He was very open to discussions. After a while, we started meeting almost daily. We certainly would see each other almost daily. And there were times when we would spend lots of time together just talking about these issues. He was extremely interested. I had a large body of useful literature on these issues. And I could see that he was very interested in sharing some of that. So really, by 1985, his interest, I think, provoked him and Shahid and Paul to write a monograph on Indians in trade unions from 1930 to 1950. I think that was published in 1985. Later, I asked him to do some sessions with me to a group of young activists, many of them medical students. Some have reached very high places in present day public service. And it was a set of sessions on political economy. And Vishnu was really wonderful. I think many of the group, if not all of them, would remember his presentations during that time. About the same, well, a little earlier actually, I had introduced him to both Ike and Doc. Now, Ike and I had been, and Coulson, my dear wife and partner, we used to go every weekend to the fetes and garage sales and so on and buy books. This was from the late 60s into the 70s. And sometimes Doc would join us and so on. So when Vishnu came to live next to us, he automatically joined the group. And it was sometime after that, well, and Ike had been talking about a bookshop from the 1970s because we had so many books which we couldn't buy, but which he thought would be very useful to one day bring together and to start up a little bookshop, almost like Doc. But he just didn't have the capital. I approached Vishnu and I said to him, we needed he needed to put together 7,000 rands. I know the figure exactly because Ike and I talked about it and we sort of made some calculation. And Vishnu just simply jumped at the idea. He was absolutely for it and didn't even ask questions about, what his, how he would be paid back or anything. Well, it was very clear he was not going to get paid back by the business. He would be a joint partner. I could do the work at the end of the year. If there was any profit, they would share it. And so I drafted an agreement, which was not more than 10 lines, I think. I was the referee, and they, without hesitation, both of them just signed it. I don't know what's happened to that agreement. I wish I had a copy of it. And we were lucky because Coulson, my wife, had a pottery studio And it was large enough to allow the bookshop some space. And that's where, in fact, the bookshop started, in Coulson's Pottery Studio in Chapel Street, Durban. And of course, it had a phone. She had a phone, and she had a tea and coffee place. And Vishnu's job was to make tea and coffee, as Ike said, for him and the madam. And he obliged every time he came from university, he would have to do that and then start dusting the books. That's what Ike asked him to do. Your job is to dust the books. And that's what that's how that partnership and that bookshop really started. And later it moved to Overport Center, and then of course to where it is presently. Doc was a different kettle of fish altogether. He was a man who tolerated very few people and very few friends, but he loved Vishnu. By the time he got, when he got to know Vishnu, he let him rummage through his archives, his books, his fondness for books, for Doc himself had selling books, secondhand books, and he had archives, and he allowed Vishnu to look at those archives, which something he wouldn't allow anyone else to do. And actually, he was happy to ask Vishnu to provide a safe house for the few people who were underground, and that's what Vishnu did, right in the flat next door to us. Later, I also introduced him to Alec Irwin, who was the education officer for both Fusatu and Fusatu. And that's how that he came to join the Economic Trends research group with some of the best known left-wing economists in the country at the time. And I think Vishnu enjoyed that, contributed to it, and learned enormously from that group of really, at the time, the most prestigious left-wing intellectuals in the country. Yeah, Vishnu also loved to play bridge. We played bridge till 1, 2 in the morning with Doc right into the 1990s. And him and I played squash regularly. I don't know if any of you know that. He was a very good squash player, and the two of us played it right up to the time I left for Johannesburg. And then unfortunately, there was a break. We didn't meet often, we couldn't. I was too busy, he was too busy. But he phoned Coulson and me throughout until now for our birthdays. That's, that's how kind of friend he was. His last interview, the last interview he did, I think, was right now with Robbie during his illness. And I was concerned about because the last interview he did was when he had just come out of a renal dialysis. And I was really worried about whether he could manage it. But he just wouldn't hear of it. Such was his intellectual commitment and his dedicated professionalism. He sat through the interview, and it went on for a long time, I think, much longer than I would have thought possible. But anyway, that's what Vishnu was, absolutely committed to his work. And I knew him in all those years, and I've always known him to be an utterly decent and honest person, unafraid of critique. He was engaging. And that's what I think attracted him to both Ike and to Doc and to so many other people. He was a dear friend, and we all will miss him greatly. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for those words, Enver. As we all know, the university institution and the defense of the academic project, scholarship of merit, free of the encumbrance either of political interference or bureaucratic interference, was something that was very close to the heart of Vishnu. And in the 1990s, he was at the University of Durban, Westville. And in this time, he worked with Jairam Reddy, who is the past Vice Chancellor of the University of Durban, Westville. Jairam is a colleague and friend of Vishnu's, developed when Vishnu served as his special advisor in the period of his vice chancellorship between the turbulent years of 1990 and 1994. And we're pleased that we have Jairam available to share some thoughts and observations and feelings on his relationship with Vishnu. Jairam. Jairam, do you want to go ahead? I don't know if you're muted.
Robbie, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you. Jairam, please go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me, Robbie?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly, yes. Please go ahead, Jairam. You can present now.
Robbie, can you hear me? Yeah. Robbie van Niekerk, Vishnu's family, friends and colleagues. Thank you very much for organizing this memorial tribute in honor of our friend and colleague, Professor Vishnu Padayachee. Thank you also for the opportunity of sharing some reflections on his very rich and textured life of Vishnu. I first met Vishnu when I moved from the University of Western Cape to the University of Durban, Westville in 1987. At that time, UDW and its context were changing. It was turbulent, volatile, and unpredictable. The civil war between the ANC and Inkatha, with many casualties, was at its peak. The UDF was attempting to make the country ungovernable. Internationally, boycotts were getting increasing traction, and the armed struggle waged by the ANC through Umkhonto we Sizwe was underway. At UDW, there was increasing and trenchant calls for the rector at the time, Professor Jaap Kreiling, the last of the Nationalist Party-sponsored rectors, to resign. It was in this milieu that I acceded to the vice-chancellorship and rectorship at UDW in January 1990. It was my very good fortune that Vishnu was seconded to the rector's office as a special advisor for a period of 3 years. The desired transformative changes at the UDW were daunting and formidable. The non-racialization of a university once meant predominantly for Indian students, the increasing admission and promotion and improvement of the infrastructure were among the challenges facing the new administration. In this atmosphere, anger, frustration, impatience, conflict were easily aroused, and the office of the rectorate was a target for instant relief, if not miraculous solutions. Vishnu's calm and sober judgment, his disarming style, his deep knowledge of the context of the university and its environment, together with the fact that he was a young and rising star in academia, provided enormous strength to the office of the rector. His structured approach, meticulous note-keeping, his quiet sense of confidence were invaluable in dealing with the intractable issues and what may be termed as wicked problems in the leadership discourse. Vishnu stood shoulder to shoulder with the rectorate in dealing with critical, conflictual, and volatile matters on campus. Just to give you a few examples. In intervening to avoid a major conflict on campus when the Inkatha-leaning Sedesmo students invited Gacha Buthelezi to speak on campus and was opposed by the ANC Learning SASCO. When the PAC-aligned student body prevented the late Van Zyl Slabbert from addressing the staff and students. And routine dealing with the Combined Staff Association, known as COMSA, who wanted, in my view, to either govern or co-govern the institution. One may remember, and we remember, and you'll hear later, one Adam Habib, latterly of Wits, was a member of COMSA. He was at times at the margins, sometime at its center. Not sure if he was a foot soldier or member of its central committee. In any case, I trust that I have learned much from Vishnu. particularly in the calm, discerning manner in which he dealt with conflict. And if he did, that would have served him well when matters got out of hand at Wits during the Fees Must Fall campaign in 2016. Notwithstanding the above, it was during this period that the University of Durham-Bristol became what Imran Valodia put it, a hotbed of intellectual activity and democratic transition. High-caliber academics were attracted to UDW, research activity intensified, and debates about academic issues and the place of UDW in the transition at the level of Senate and faculty boards became open, vigorous, and contested. For this contribution in stabilizing and enriching the Office of Directorate, I remain eternally grateful to Vishnu. As I left the university to chair the National Commission of Higher Education in 1996, Vishnu's academic trajectory took on a very high profile and was richly productive, and many academics and others would today refer to that. But I want to turn to the last years of Vishnu's life. And the interactive pandemic raged and the lockdown levels at various levels came into effect. At this time, Vishnu spent most of his last 18 months in Durban. Sadly, in the middle of last year, Vishnu took seriously ill and had to be nursed in intensive care for over a period of a month. During this period of recuperation, when he came out of hospital, in between doing household chores and picking up his daughter from the Westville Girls' School, Vishnu made Maynard Governor his law practice, which was located between his home and Westville Girls' College, his second home. There he found time to relax, to engage in animated conversation, and enjoy his favorite whiskey or wine. Personal circumstances led to relocation from his home in Westville to a flat in Curry Road. This appears to give him a new lease of life. It was a lovely flat in an older building with a lot of character, with the stunning view of the gravel racecourse and the city of Durban extending to the Indian Ocean. The magnificent yellowwood dining table and the walnut bookcase accommodated the fine things that Vishnu loved: his books, his paintings, his sculptures. His many friends would join him in this congenial flat for lunch, for teas, or for a drink. As I was having lunch and interviewing Vishnu in this flat of our days at UDW, as I'm writing my memoirs, the caretaker of the flat entered with a box of books. Vishnu explained that these books were put out for sale at the once a month in the Antique Sunday Market in La Lucia Mall. Vishnu's deep love of books, which you already heard from Enver, took him to this mall on a Sunday, despite his fragile state of health. You will hear more from the others about setting up the Ike's bookshop in Morningside. As we conversed, Vishnu mentioned that he interviewed many candidates for academic positions during his career. And his top question would be, what are you reading these days? And he mentioned that will reveal a great deal about the character of the candidate. About 2 weeks ago, rather inexplicably, Vishnu again took ill and was admitted to intensive care in a critical condition. He was, after a week or 10 days, he was weaned off oxygen and was getting stronger and ready to return to his flat. As his close friend in a flat felt, we found a nursing home. And the nursing home was Tainsuck. Some of you may remember at the corner of Curry Road and Sydenham Road in the Berea, not far from his present Curry Road flat. It was a 2-bedroom flat on the 8th floor, again with stunning views of the city. Help was there available through a panic button should it need be. On Friday morning, the 28th of May, Maynard Govender spoke to Vishnu, who was recovering well from hospital, and he was excited about moving to his new flat in Tainsik. I spoke with Celeste, the director of Tainsik, that afternoon, and said Vishnu will be coming and we expect to sign the papers and move in on Monday morning. At 4 a.m. on Saturday morning, Maynard called and broke the devastating news that we had lost Vishnu. As the funeral on Monday the 31st, the day of his birthday, was a small private affair, 14 of his closest friends in Durban met for a memorial service in Maynard's rooms in Westville. At the same time, the funeral was underway at the Clara State Crematorium. We met in order to share the grief at the passing of our friend and colleague, to share some reflections on his life. And in the end, which we did, and we then opened a bottle of Rhein's and Zinfandel and toasted the life of Vishnu with this glass of wine, which I'm sure he would have enjoyed and would have approved of. As I conclude this tribute, shorn of the academic achievements and his formidable intellect, who was the true Mahavishnu Padayachee? Time and again at the memorial service, where friend after friend, revealed the following about Vishnu. He was a man of human decency, of humility, of values of ethics and integrity, which was so intrinsic to his character. He was a man of compassion and caring, the capacity to listen and engage in animated conversation, whether it was a policeman across from his flat, the housekeeper, the gardener, the student, or the professor. Go well, Vishnu, and rest in peace. You left your family, your friends, your students, and academic colleagues a very rich legacy, which will be revered for many, many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jairam. Thank you for those words. Vishnu's interest is well known in terms of economic strategies that could socially transform our society from its racial capitalist past. In this, he endeavored in the early years of the transition with a group of economists and like-minded comrades, intellectual comrades, to develop a program and a framework that could lead to a far more fundamental social transformation of our society. And we're very pleased, and this is one of his connections with a South African, but a South African abroad, John Sender, who's Emeritus Professor of Economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and a close friend and intellectual comrade of Vishnu's, in particular in the period of their working together in the macroeconomic research group. MERG was very important for Vishnu, and it was convened under the intellectual leadership of the celebrated South African liberation fighter and economist Vella Pillay, who Vishnu held in the very highest of esteem. The MERG group developed with local economists an alternative and modeled social democratic inspired development strategy for South Africa in the transition era. MERG was a reasoned, viable alternative to what Vishnu felt was the uninspiring and inequality-inducing market fundamentalism that informed the economic policy program eventually adopted, described as MERG, and without meaningful consultation. And we're very happy that John can join us and share some views and observations and feelings on Vishnu. John.
Thank you, Robbie. Thank you very much. I feel privileged to have the chance to say a few words on this important occasion. I'd like to start with a question. My question is, how do you quickly get to know somebody really well? And I mean really well, become aware of their very best qualities. I've got two initial thoughts. One is that you drink some wine with them and some whiskey with them, and Vishnu enjoyed whiskey as well as wine, and enjoyed it alongside a mutual friend of ours, the late Harry Zarenda, an economist at Wits, whom Vishnu and I both miss very much. But the wine induces a sort of gossipy friendship, perhaps not a really deep one. People say also that another strategy, another answer to my question might be to go to bed with someone. Now, neither Vishnu or I were inclined to do that with one another. I think the best strategy, and I put forward this as a tentative answer to my question, is to write something together with someone, or edit something together with someone. And I did this, I was privileged to do this on 3 occasions with Vishnu. The first, as Robbie has already alluded to, was in the work that Vishnu and I did for the macroeconomic research group, in particularly editing the final report of that group, which was called Making Democracy Work, and was published in 1993. It was a difficult task. There were a number of academic and other economists responsible for producing different chapters. Many of them, as is the way with academics, had prima donna tendencies, and you required considerable diplomatic skills, which unfortunately I lack, but which Vishnu had in abundance to organize this. And it was also a difficult thing to do because of the political context, a context which I think both Vishnu and I misjudged. We were anxious in editing the book that our approach was too soft, too middle-of-the-road Keynesian, and that the ANC and COSATU and the Mass Democratic Movement that commissioned this work from us would reject it on the grounds that it was too right-wing, that it was not radical enough in terms of economic policy for the ANC. A curious irony to think back on how wrong we were. And indeed, Vishnu's important work with Robbie begins to ask that question, why did so many people get it wrong? The second occasion on which I was privileged to write something with Vishnu directly was when we wrote an article, the title of which was Revolutionary Activist and Economic Policy Analysis, which was an account of the life and work of Vela Pillay, a very distinguished South African economist. And I was very, very glad to work with Vishnu on this and learned a lot from him. Again, he stopped me from being too rude and outrageous about opportunists within the ANC. I'll mention no names because it's not an appropriate context. Finally, and rather sadly, Vela and I discussed, Vishnu and I discussed, but never wrote up our idea that we would write a life of Patsy Pillay, who was extremely important as an activist both on the left in South Africa before she left, and in the anti-apartheid movement while she was in London. Talking to Vishnu about Patsy gave me an idea of what many people have stressed so far, and that is how very kind, how very thoughtful, how very humane Vishnu was in his dealing with Vela Pillai's wife and with so many other people. I'm going to sum up now what I wanted to say, and that is that working and writing with Vishnu helped me to appreciate several things. Firstly, his intellectual self-confidence. He had no axe to grind, no arguments he had to defend as though his life depended on it. He could throw his babies out when writing and could propose very calmly alternative formulations because he was confident about his own intellectual abilities. Associated with this is another characteristic of Vishnu's, that is his intellectual honesty, his integrity. And finally, I think others will mention or have already begun to mention an extraordinary feature of the man, and that was his efficiency, his diligence. He would respond to a draft, a new section, a chapter, almost instantaneously, carefully, meticulously. And he would make the same response to a personal email, making a personal request. In all one's dealings with him, he was rapid and thorough, showing a entirely admirable respect for people, for other human beings. I'll miss him very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. Alongside John, working with Vishnu in the macroeconomic research group was Ben Fine. And Ben is an emeritus professor of economics at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. And also, we're very privileged to have him as such, a visiting professor at the Wits School of Governance. And alongside John, as I mentioned, Ben also worked closely with Vishnu in the macroeconomic research group. And in the opportunities that were available, opened up his heart and home to Vishnu when passing through London. And where also their friendship developed, which included their shared love of cricket and football. And a testimony, I think, to Vishnu's commitment to internationalism, I think he was an internationalist to his core, was his willingness to embrace ideas from whomever source of the world it came from, where its purpose was intended at fundamental social change from a deeply human standpoint. Ben, could I ask you to share some of your thoughts and observations, please?
Can you hear me? I cannot start the video.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you, Ben. Please.
You can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Thank you. Thank you. I can't hear myself on the thing. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It is such a sad and tragic occasion, but I feel privileged to share some thoughts with you on our dear friend Vishnu. And I hope I can add a few threads to the tapestry of tributes and memories contributed by others. I first met Vishnu in 1987 when asked by the London-based ANC as a member of EROSA, which was a sort of predecessor to MERG, to visit South Africa and review local political economy in general and the work of the Economic Trends Group in particular. striking and enduring features of Vishnu were immediately apparent, and John Sender has just referred to these. His absolute commitment to scholarly integrity and unwillingness to bandwagon for personal or intellectual advancement. I also met Bill Freund at the same time. His commitment to intellectual and academic life was no less than Vishnu's, but he was also more compromising, trading reservations which he would accept with a shrug of resignation. Without about group speak for being able to get on with the collective endeavor. Unlike others encountered at that time, most of whom went on to bigger and better things in commerce, government, or politics, Vishnu and Bill were unique in their dedication to the world of ideas as opposed to their own ascent up one or other greasy pole. For Vishnu in particular, his combination of reserve and reservations was at once both suitable and unsuitable for the brash certainties of South African for or against us politics. Suitable when courted for his capabilities and status. Again, we've heard how much he's done for others, but unsuitable when questioning hardline dogmas. In hindsight, Vishnu negotiated the corresponding rapids of push and pull with considerable panache, without once, in my knowledge, ever faltering in negotiating those rapids. Everyone sought their piece of Vishnu, and within reason, they generally got it. But he even managed to retain a bit of himself, for pleasure and pursuits, both simple and sophisticated. That I will not again share a good bottle of wine over dinner with Vishnu does not bear thinking about. Following our earlier meetings, Vishnu became a major participant in the MERG project. I will say no more about this. It is ably covered in the recent book by Vishnu himself and Robbie. Throughout, I've been constrained by my own personal circumstances, and I've only ever been able to spend very short periods of time in South Africa. On each occasion where possible, I would meet up with Vishnu and with Bill, and sometimes individually outside of South Africa as well. And I would have major catch-ups with both. Our conversations would always be wide-ranging and leave me astonished with both how much I had learned on these meetings and how much I still had to learn. I feel that over the year or so, I've been bereaved 3 times over, having lost Bill, Vishnu, and Bill and Vishnu, with what had been the added value of the erstwhile Durban duo over the sum of their individual richnesses. Despite or even because of the short and interrupted personal interactions, Vishnu and I became closer friends at a slow but steady pace, if most tragically for me now, accelerating in depth and breadth over the most recent years. I believe he came to trust me more, opening up both intellectually and personally, increasingly with warmth and shared enjoyments. Our discussions of soccer and cricket were extensive, as mentioned, and I would attempt to tease him, only partially successfully, given his calm persona, with the prospect of sharing my signed photographs of the likes of Godfrey Evans, Dennis Compton, and Tom Graveney, which I had collected as a child. With artifacts other than cars, the older the better for Vishnu, history and society seen, appreciated, and critically assessed through its material and its cultural dimensions. After MERG, we shared some ideas frequently and worked together on a number of occasions, always fruitfully and pleasantly. Our last piece of work was basically the work of Vishnu alone, but he generously included me as a co-author, although I did try to decline. It concerned a post-apartheid loan from the IMF to the first post-apartheid government, the Government of National Unity. That, as I insisted against the ideology of the ANC having been beholden to the IMF, this loan had never been necessary, let alone taken up by the government. In short, GEAR was an ANC own goal, not an IMF penalty. For this simple idea, I got a publication, whilst Vishnu did all of the primary research and most of the writing. This indicates so much about Vishnu's generosities and capabilities as first and second nature, his apparently effortless achievements and yet hard graft, and his dogged patience and conscientiousness, as well as his predilection for measured passions, from map collecting to me, quite bizarrely, following the Oscar Pistorius trial on TV. The latter I take to be one of his occasional eccentricities from left field, another being his bizarre insistence that I was a doppelganger for Joe Root, possibly his own way of teasing me. I did write all this up, but I'm going off script now because it just so happens that today, Coventry City begins its first day as the culture city of the UK, Coventry being my town of city of birth. Of course, the year in which I first met Vishnu was the year in which Coventry City beat Spurs in the 1987 Cup final. That I will be unable to tease Vishnu about this again is almost as unbearable as not being able to share a bottle of wine with him. In retrospect, I realize what is striking for me about Vishnu, and I've given this a lot of thought, is that I always came away after engaging with him, reflecting that he had yet more strings to his bow of which I had previously been unaware in intellectual, practical, and personal spheres. That richness of many lives, talents, and contributions has been brought out by the tsunami of tributes that have flowed, connecting the many aspects of his life, often one part unknown to another. Again, I've learned so much just by listening today. This is testimony, can't say it, to his persona as gentleman scholar, a polymath who enjoyed life, especially where he could enjoy and share it with others and put his and their talents to good purpose. I hope to have captured at least a smidgen of the Vishnu we knew and loved. He is sorely and irreplaceably missed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. The third speaker we have from broadly, I would describe as the international community, is Jonathan Michie. And Jonathan is a British economist and holds the joint post of Director of the Department for Continuing Education and President of Kellogg College of the University of Oxford. Enjoying a long-standing friendship with Vishnu since the late 1980s with joint publications, including until very recently, Jonathan also organized and hosted a very memorable launch in Oxford of Vishnu's final co-authored book, Shadow of Liberation. Jonathan, would you like to share some thoughts with us?
Yes, thank you very much, Robbie. I feel also very privileged to have been invited to speak, and very honoured to have an affiliation at Wits, which is thanks and due to Vishnu, as well as Imran, obviously. In 1992, I visited Wits at the invitation of Fuad Qasim, who I'm pleased to say is at this gathering. And on my first day, I bumped into Bella Pillay there, and me and my wife, Callan, were good friends with Bella and Patsy from my wife Callan being in the same anti-apartheid branch as them. And Bella introduced me to Vishnu. I'm delighted to say that Bella, John Sender and Vishnu then involved me in the work of Merg, in a, which has been referred to before, which I keep on my desk as a Bible, involved me in a very modest research assistant sort of way, for which I'm extremely grateful. And one of the most impressive things about Vishnu is that despite the failure of the ANC to take up the policies to overcome the legacy of apartheid, Vishnu just carried on regardless, making the case, convinced that sooner or later progress would be made. And one place he did that during the 1990s was at Cambridge, where he was a visiting fellow at Robinson College and an academic visitor at the Judge Business School of the University of Cambridge, where he wrote about it in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, and in a book on South Africa's tradition, which I'm pleased to say does include a chapter by Harry Zerenda. And then, as Robbie's just said, he continued this throughout, and his latest book with Robbie, The Shadow of Liberation, the two of them spoke fantastically at Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. Vishnu is also a visiting fellow at Kellogg College, University of Oxford, and I'll put in the chat the link for their tremendous presentation, which was in November 1919, just 4 months before lockdown, which was absolutely fantastic. But he continued beyond that, including during his illness, editing 2 special issues of the International Review of Applied Economics, firstly on post-apartheid South Africa, and then secondly, more broadly, on alternative corporate forms in the global South. And he's brought together the papers from both these special issues to be published in a book, which ironically and tragically will be published later this month. So I would just echo everything that's been said about Vishnu. He's absolutely tremendous individual. And I think that the living legacy from all of us has to be to redouble our efforts to take forward Vishnu's work to improve the lives of the people across South Africa and indeed across the global South. So go well, Vishnu, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. We need to deviate slightly from the program because Joe Rushby is experiencing very, very serious problems with power supply and outages. So we'll take Joe's observations now on Vishnu. Joe is a former student of Vishnu's, a friend and partner at the iconic Ike's bookshop. Sorry, that's the dogs seem to be going crazy there. Sorry, let me repeat that. Joe Rushby is a former student of Vishnu's, friend and business partner at the iconic Ike's bookshop, which he currently manages. Following a presentation, a short video will be played on Ike's bookshop, which was such a feature of Vishnu's life outside the academy. Joe.
Thanks, Robbie. It's so lovely to see all these familiar faces and hear tributes to Vishnu. I'm very honored to speak about him. But before I just read my tribute, I'd like to say on behalf of Cedric and the Adams crew, Robert Seaberg and Carmen G, who continue to work, live and breathe Ike's. I first met Vishnu as a student at the School of Development Studies in 2000. Economics was not my beat, but his lectures dazzled, always running over the allotted hour. None of us complained. Through the grapevine, I heard that he and Julian May were looking for assistance in their bookshop. Although I'd worked in bookstores in Charing Cross Road, I arrived at Ike's as an apprentice. Julian and Vishnu knew their books. They knew their food and wine even better. It was the beginning of an adventure and a world of wonder. Book lovers who first went to Ike's in Chapel Street and made a turn, younger readers hunted for Homer, and famous authors launched their books and signed the war. There are memories embedded in every book and corner. Laughter, tears, joy, conversation, as the bookstore grew into so much more. A meeting place for debate, art exhibitions, wine tasting. An institution so fluid that it spilled onto the balcony, down the stairs and on into Mama Luciano's. Vishnu and I shared a mutual love for foraging in bookshops, cricket, crosswords, and English football. And like Ben, I disagree with him. He was a Spurs supporter, I Nottingham Forest. Every month or so, we'd drive inland to Smarisburg, Midlands, dusty shops, houses, barns, collections of old Natal families, retired academics, and the search never ended. Vishnu was the English gent, He went cucumber sandwiches to Harris Tweed with the best of them. They spoke cricket, and he knew more than them. They went to Michael House, but he'd just spoken at Cambridge. They spoke of vintage wine, and he pulled a rare pinotage from the boot of his beloved BMW. Lunch was often in competition with the book hunting. And as late afternoon fell over the Dargle Valley, people were always ready to offload their first edition Biggles to this man who came out of nowhere but had been everywhere. And as we got onto the N3, there was a hint of a smile at a bargain wrought and too much paid to a biddy who thought she had a rare signed copy of Enid Blyton. In a few weeks, we'd be down the south coast, a turn past his hometown of Umkomaas, and perhaps a stop at his mother's for the famous peanut chutney. This most learned and cultured man taught me so much. So it was, and will never be again. We took a different turn for the past few years, but just over a month ago, and thanks to his friend Maynard, we spoke again. It was a very important conversation. It was like we were still on the road. We left. He sounded happy. He was starting a new life, and we talked of books and life, his recent finds, and the possibility of foraging for Ikes again. Once more, I was the apprentice and he the craftsman. Vishnu lives at Ikes, on the bookshelves, the walls and on the floor, surrounded by books, is how I remember him. I've no doubt he's up there in the sky, combing the stars for first editions and vintage wines. The world of books and literature in Durban owes a huge debt of gratitude to Vishnu, and so do I. Lastly, I think Vishnu would be very proud to see where Ikes is today. There's a lively debate, there's chance meetings, often of old friends, and many new friendships have been born. A younger generation has emerged, and it is an extremely happy and peaceful space. It's a great pity that he didn't get to see it again. Yesterday, one of my customers came in, and as is the way of Ikes, I thought it was a good chance to share with all of you a spontaneous event, which will now be played. Go well, Vishnu.
Thank you, Joe, for that very beautiful tribute. A big part of Vishnu's life was his role as a mentor, working with the academy, with fine scholars, in particular scholars in development in South Africa. We engaged them on the different features of their own intellectual interests and intellectual life, and were themselves so very deeply introduced by Vishnu to new ideas, economic and socially transformative. So to start, in a sense, to pay tribute to those scholars and their meaning for Vishnu, and there are so many, we'd first like to ask Adam Abeb, who's well known to you. Adam is the past Vice Chancellor of Wits University and current Director of SOAS. Adam's intellectual relationship and friendship with Vishnu extends back to the 1980s as a student of Vishnu's, including as a supervised doctoral student, and then academic colleague in the School of Development Studies Vishnu directed, and latterly as a senior colleague at Wits University during the period of Adam's vice chancellorship there. Adam.
Thank you, Robbie. So colleagues, friends, it's really a bit nostalgic to speak about Vishnu, but to speak about Vishnu after that moving tribute by Joe and Ike's bookshop, that was what he loves so much, and to do so from so far away. You know, many of you have written beautifully about Vishnu over the last couple of days. But what I want to do is bring a lens to the Vishnu story from some of us who interacted with him at UDW in the late 1980s, early 1990s. You know, South Africa in the late 80s, early 1990s had two incredible transformative managerial experiences in higher education. The first was UWC in Cape Town. And a few years later, as Jairam spoke about it, was UDW. And Vishnu, in many ways, both those experiences produced a new generation of academics and scholars, a new generation of policy experts, managers of public institutions, and vice chancellors and higher education executives. Many of the people from UWC and UDW went to lead on many, many institutions across the nation. And Vishnu was central to that UDW experiment. He was always the elder scholar. He was always an uncle, even when he was young, to the activists who coalesced around UDW in those days. But he was also, as Jairam spoke about it, a bridge to the management. He had this incredible capacity to calm us activists down, and yet still open up opportunities for gains within the framework of what was possible within the institution. It was an incredible experience, those years. But the contradictions of that historical moment, the contradictions of that setting, and the ignorance and, dare I say, the arrogance of some of us activists during that moment imploded that experience. And it impacted us in devastating ways. And all of us parted from UDW at different moments. Yet, despite our parting from UDW, Vishnu remained a mentor. He remained somebody who interacted with all of those people who had been part of the UDW experience. And he continued to live with us. I went on to do a PhD in New York, and he served as my South African supervisor. When I returned, I went back to UDW, and then I went to Natal. And he, in a sense, I went to launch the Center for Civil Society, which is associated with the School of Development Studies. And he taught me how to navigate the politics, the very peculiar politics of Natal University. And it was peculiar, and he allowed me to navigate it. He served on the board of the Center for Civil Society, and he served as a mentor, an intellectual mentor, to big projects that Imran and I had around social movements and philanthropy and a project that Mamumuchi and I had managed around civil society in Africa. I remember fondly travels that Mamumuchi and I and Vishnu would do around the continent. I remember this one moment in Dar es Salaam when we went to a gallery of liberation in the middle of Dar es Salaam. And Vishnu was staring at this wonderful photograph. And this young man came to him and next to him and said to Vishnu, "Do you like it?" And Vishnu said, "It's gorgeous." And the young guy pulled it off the wall and said to Vishnu, $10, $10 if you can have it. And Vishnu was utterly appalled. I know many others would have walked away, but his ethics wouldn't allow him. And he was utterly appalled by that. His ethics came to the fore. I remember another event in the middle of Cairo where we went with Mamumuchi and came across a bar in the middle of Cairo that served as the underground venue for the Politburo of NASA. And Mamumuchi was in his moment. He was crying about here he was this great nationalist, this venue of this great nationalist NASA, and tears streaming down. And I was rolling my eyes saying only Mama would cry about this. And Vishnu sat there in the middle of Cairo, calming him down and sympathizing with him. Those beautiful memories about the humanity of what it was to be with Vishnu. Vishnu and I went on to write articles on the political economy of South Africa and the politics of South Africa. Even though we disagreed, I can't help saying this, Ben and John and Jonathan, even though we disagreed on the potential of mud, I often teased him saying that it was only a group of economists who would confuse politics with engaging with politicians. And he always took it in a kind of good-natured spirit. But he always remained in touch with all of us, not only me, but every one of us in that UDW experience. In the next few decades, he, in a sense, kept us all in touch with each other. Whenever I would go to Durban, he and Imran would take me to introduce me to new restaurants that had emerged in the Durban scene. Or we'd kind of meet at Ike's and have our own little shindig. When I became Vice Chancellor at Wits and Imran joined us, Vishnu joined us, as did others like Dori, to rebuild economics, because that was the big agenda. And Jairam was right. He counseled us. I met him far more often. But Jairam is absolutely right. That early experience of UDW lived with us throughout the fees must fall experience at Wits, and allowed us to learn the experiences and perhaps even not make the mistakes that we made in the early 1990s. I communicated with him the night before. I had written to him on a WhatsApp and said to him, look, I heard you ill. And he wrote back saying, look, I'd love to talk. And he was in the middle of ICU, and we agreed that as soon as he said to me, he thinks he'll be out in a day or two. And I promised to call him. And then, of course, we got the news the next day that he had passed on. It won't happen again. But rest in peace, Vishnu. You so deserve it. And know that your legacy lives on through so many others. Until we meet again, wherever that may be. Ambane Gashle, my friend, comrade, and mentor. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, for those heartfelt words. Another important scholar in Vishnu's life was Dori Posel, who is a senior professor and chair of economics at UCT, who specializes in applied macroeconomic research. He's a colleague of Vishnu's when he was head of the School of Development Studies at UKZN. And in more recent years, they were colleagues at the School of Economics and Finance at the University of the Witwatersrand. Dori.
Thank you, Robbie. Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. Many people who are celebrating Vishnu today knew Vishnu and his many dimensions far better than I am. But having been in the academy now as a student and then as an academic for almost 40 years, I feel I can speak with some integrity about Vishnu as a head of school. I've worked under or with many heads of school over the decades, and Vishnu was without doubt an exceptional leader. He was head of the School of Development Studies at UKZN during part of the time that I held Saatchi chair at the university. Vishnu had all the attributes that make an excellent head. He was forward-looking, as many people have mentioned, efficient, organized, and proactive. And so the school that he led was dynamic, enabling, and well-oiled, with nothing left to fester or molder. No message that was sent to Vishnu got lost in the ether. And he always had ideas for ways in which the school could consolidate and expand on its teaching and research programs and extend its reach in the wider community. At the same time as he steered this streamlined ship, Vishnu was also a fair and judicious captain. I don't think I ever saw Vishnu as head of school be nasty, put someone down, or stifle debate. What was also distinctive is that Vishnu was a generous captain. He celebrated the success of others as much as he wanted his own success celebrated, never begrudging praise or recognition. And as no one can dispute, Vishnu had gravitas. He was eloquent, well-informed, well-connected, and worldly. He would compose a page of text about a proposed new development in the school that had been discussed at one of our regular Monday morning meetings within a half hour of the meeting finishing. And the text would be finely crafted and error-free. These characteristics have been remarked upon and appreciated on many occasions and by many colleagues, including by Daniela Casale, Glenn Robbins, Mike Rogan, Richard Ballard, Mary Smith, Judith Schrier, Carnegie, Naidu, and probably too many to mention. We were incredibly fortunate to have worked with Vishnu as our head of school. And in a time of increasing managerialism at universities, we were aware of how lucky we were. So much so that Daniela and I, having spent much of the 2000s attending conferences where we bemoaned bitterly the fate of economics at UKZN, spent a few years literally gloating at how lucky we were to be part of a school with regular Monday morning workshops, Wednesday seminars, a dedicated library, efficient, helpful, and informed administrators, a diverse student body, and Vishnu as our head of school. And of course, a school in which people met regularly in the so-called tea room, supplied always with filter coffee and very often with cake for celebration, from a birthday to a new car, new baby, pending marriage, academic success, or the nachas of parents. I last saw Vishnu with Judith on the 10th of May at St. Clement's in Durban. Daniela couldn't join us as planned because of the loss of her grandmother on that very morning. So just the three of us met for coffee and an early lunch at the big table under the tree. Vishnu seemed more buoyant than he had in a while. He was starting a new life chapter, taking ownership of a new car, collecting books, with research recently completed and new research underway, and with new roots taking hold in old friendships that had lain fallow for some long years. He spoke with love and deep affection of some of the people who were so important in his life. I left St. Clement's thinking that Vishnu was over the worst. And so I was stunned the next week at the message we received, 3 weeks later that we received on last Saturday morning. You left us far too early, Vishnu. You still had so much to contribute and so much life to enjoy, but you will remain forever celebrated in our memories. Thank you, Robbie.
Thank you, Dori. Julian May is another friend of Vishnu's who had great scholarly influence on Julian's development. Julian's currently the director of the Center of Excellence in Food Security and the UNESCO Chair in African Food Systems. He worked with Vishnu at the School of Development Studies at UKZN. He's a friend and postdoctoral student of Vishnu, and they were able recently to rekindle their long-standing shared intellectual interests through the iconic Ike's Bookshop, which they co-founded with Joe Rushby. Julian.
Thanks for giving me this opportunity. Vishnu and I had many bonds over the almost 30 years that we worked together as colleagues, co-authors, and co-presenters. We shared the responsibility of being the head of the School of Development Studies, and we shared in the rejuvenation of Ike's Bookstall. Vishnu helped me shift from the carefree life of a mid-career researcher to the responsibilities of academic leadership, accompanying me to my first Senate meeting and graduating me with my PhD. We both loved a good lunch with chilled white wine. We both loved good scholarship, preferably if it involved a visit to the reading room in the British Library. We had many shared interests, but not sport. He once tried to explain cricket to me, but unusually for Vishnu, failed miserably. But many people are not aware of one thing that he and I did share. We had both signed the Protection of the State Information Act of 1982, commonly referred to as the Official Secrets Act. Vishnu and I believe that scholarship required knowledge of praxis, and as part of this, he served on the board of directors of the South African Reserve Bank, while I served on the Statistics Council of Stats SA. Agreeing to keep information confidential was a requirement for both roles, hence the signing of the Act. We would often joke with one another about this, but we never talked shop, and we certainly did not share our secrets. Well, there was one exception. Through 2002, the Reserve Bank had increased the repo as part of the inflation targeting policy and the overall fiscal discipline that characterized government thinking at that time. The Rand was sitting at around R7.50 to the dollar. GDP was chugging away at 3.7% per annum. The interest rate was 11%, rising eventually to 13%, and unemployment was a hefty 33.5%, a peak that we haven't seen again until this year. In March 2003, in separate meetings of the council and the board, the statistician general Paddy Lachotla and the governor of the Reserve Bank Tito Mboweni discussed the contents of the letters that they had received from John Stopford, an economist, now working at Investec. In the letter, John pointed out errors in the calculation of the consumer price index, the benchmark of monetary policy. These arose from the use of outdated information and methods to calculate the rental income component. The effect was that Stats SA was estimating a higher inflation rate than was actually the case, and that the error was compounding over time. And naturally, the Monetary Policy Committee at the Reserve Bank was basing its decisions on these flawed policy, on these flawed data, and potentially applying the wrong medicine by increasing the repo rate. I sat in the one meeting and Vishnu sat in the other. As Charles Meth, who served with me on the council, remarked, there is nothing that will get the capitalist piggies more upset than getting the inflation rate wrong. Charles was right. The newspapers had a field day when the news became public. As luck would have it, Vishnu and I met at the airport after these meetings. He on his way to the BA business class lounge, me on the way to the SAA lounge. We abandoned the soft seats and the free whiskey to sit at a coffee bar to talk shop. I don't recall if Video Cafe had opened at the airport back then, but I do remember that our conversation was animated and sometimes heated. The council had raised concerns about South Africa's economic statistics in 2002, but these had not been addressed. As a Keynesian, Vishnu had raised concerns about the effectiveness of further interest rate increases, but this had not been considered. And as a recent new homeowner, every increase in the interest rate meant fewer lunches for me and less white wine. We shared our interests and, like Lendon, pondered what is to be done. We then headed off to our flights back to Durban. Vishnu in business class in a Jameson, as was Reserve Bank policy, and me in economy class with the bells, as was Stats SA policy. Vishnu and I always planned to write a paper on our shared experiences as when we were actually policymakers, the time that we served on the council and the board. My last conversation with Vishnu was on the 17th of April. He called to give his condolences for the death of my brother who had passed away the day before. We spoke about my brother's love of books, music, and paintings. We ended the conversation with our hope that he and I, Vishnu and I, would soon be able to meet over lunch, perhaps in Cape Town or Durban. I'm guessing that I'm going to have to write that paper alone now. Although there's a thought. Maybe it would be better if Yanni Rousseau, whom Vishnu graduated with me, and who we had dinner together after that graduation. Perhaps Yanni and I should write up this episode in a chapter, in a book, commemorating our much loved and admired mentor and friends. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Julian. In Vishnu's life, his scholarships and friendships were very deeply intertwined, and none more so perhaps than Caroline Skinner, who is a senior scholar at the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, amongst other. She has been a long-standing friend of Vishnu's for over 25 years. Caroline.
Thank you. I was just noting that I'm the 12th speaker, so I'm worried you guys might be flagging. So I wanted to just quickly mention that over the last week, Imran and I have been reflecting about how much Vishnu spoke about this event. Over the last 25 years, I've known him. Were countless mentions. And I've really been kind of experiencing the event a little bit through his eyes, and he would have loved this. So even though it's a bit long, all of this he just would have loved. So I'm also encouraging you, if you are flagging, just to dip out and go and get some delicious whiskey or something that he would have loved to drink, and enjoy it. And remember that he's with us and really just enjoying every detail. So I'm going to be very quick. I'm just going to share a few reflections. The best of my time with Vishnu was spent in animated conversation of delicious lunches, but also exploring the wild and wonderful parts of Durban, the arcades around Grey Street, the docks or Valley of a Thousand Hills. We shared a love of the city and a deep commitment to its transformation. He opened my eyes to its fraught history, not only on paper through feeding me fascinating literature, something that he continued to do until the last weeks of his life, but also through his own experience of it. I admired his sharp intellect, his breadth of knowledge, his passion for his country, and his commitment to structural change. Despite, or perhaps in concert with, his love of expensive cars and whiskey, he worked alongside worker-based movements and social movements in support of their struggles. He was hugely generous with his time and expertise and meticulous in support of his students. Vishnu had a vision for South African universities, which he pursued in many ways. The one that I had a privilege of being part of was the School of Development Studies at UKZN. Under the leadership first of Mike Morris and then Vishnu and Imran and Julian, the School of Development Studies was not only one of the best places in the world to study, but also a path-breaking research institute. In addition, they achieved a place of real solidarity, camaraderie, and fun. And I just noting how many people from those days are in this room. So sending you a huge warm hug, because really what we created is a rarity in the world of academia. And I keep on saying kind of an example of institution building that we all should learn from. Vishnu was a very loyal friend to so many of us. He was a quiet presence at all the big moments of my time in Durban. I was thinking back, Glenn Robbins, when you and I were fighting with Mike Sutcliffe around the plan to build the mall in Warwick Junction. Vishnu and I spoke at length about how to frame the arguments. When I was struggling with an academic paper, he would read it and give incisive feedback and critique. Let's also be clear, we fought and a lot of the people in the room will attest to that. At my farewell speech, he called me his conscience, something I was quite complimented by. When I saw that he was erring to the right, seduced by the power of a seat at the table on the Reserve Bank, I would call him on it. He would do the same to me, calling me on my contradictions, calling me to think and question more deeply. We would argue, sometimes for days, but all along I knew that he was 100% behind my academic work and activism. Over the past 25 years, if the truth be told, I spent a lot of time worrying about Vishnu. With real brilliance comes an intensity and a fraughtness. His heart and part of his spirit was never settled. So one solace is that he is finally at peace. Hambagachle, Vishnu.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for that very heartfelt tribute. A passion of Vishnu's was his commitment to his students and his doctoral students, encouraging and developing thinking, encouraging them to develop their rigor as scholars in development. We have two scholars now differently positioned who are recent postgraduate and doctoral postgraduate students of Vishnu. The first is Lumkile Monde, who is an economist and scholar based at the School of Economics and Finance at Wits University. Lumkile is Vishnu's recent PhD graduate, a comrade and also a friend. Vishnu spoke many times to me of Lumkile's fine analytic abilities on current economic problems and his critique of the government's neoliberal economic policy choices, and his hopes for Lumkile as a future economist of note for the country's transformation. Lumkile.
Good evening, colleagues. One morning in 2014, I bumped at the parking lot of the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa on Professor Imran Valodia. Professor Valodia chaired the support program for industrial and innovation managed by the IDC, where I worked for many years. In that short meeting, I informed him that I was leaving the IDC to complete a PhD, which I had shelved in 1993 due to a lack of funding. Following our conversation, Professor Valodia then reached out to a friend of mine, a comrade and Vishnu's co-supervisor for my PhD, Professor Keith Breckenridge, who is based at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research. I asked Keith if he knew anyone from the School of Economics and Finance, referred to then as the School of Economics and Business Science, who could supervise a PhD. He sent me to Vishnu. At my first meeting with Vishnu in May 2015, he created a comfortable environment, allowing me to do all the talking about my PhD proposal, which was on ESCOM, the vertically integrated state-owned power utility. Vishnu listened attentively, looked straight into my eyes as I mumbled through my ideas. He was captivating with a beautiful smile, and through his eyes, I could see joy and love that was to lead to a very deep relationship between us on our first date. In that meeting, I came out with a belief that I could do this. Together with Keith Breckenridge as a co-supervisor, we completed a thesis titled The Restructuring of ESCOM from 1983 and Beyond. Vishnu, Keith, and I, the student, would meet at my bread and butter bakery in Parkview, discussing different chapters of my thesis over a 4-year period. This also overlapped with the work Vishnu was doing with Robbie van Niekerk that led to the publication of Shadow of Liberation. This allowed us to spend time together interviewing different persons for our projects. At my bread and butter and Franco's Pizzeria and Trattoria restaurant in Parkview, Vishnu had his own table where he would spend half a day meeting different people. At the restaurant's entrance, you just had to say, "I'm meeting the professor." They will take you to his table. At one of our meetings, I arrived early at my bread and butter, and there was Professor Ed Webster seated and engaged with Vishnu on what appeared as if it were the 1980s South Africa, and I, a member of the Special Security Branch, would have believed they were communist-inspired hatching a plot to overthrow the state. The Southern Center for Inequality Studies was born. In what had now developed into a personal relationship between Vishnu and his student, myself, we would meet separately, discussing everything from my thesis, new and old books he had just acquired, love, sports, and travel. With a plate of food and a glass of South African Chardonnay in the Parkview restaurants in Gauteng, or at Lupa Osteria, Westville in KZN, the discussions on the corporation, that is the firm, took most of our time. These discussions on the corporation were partly informed by my continuing role as a director of companies, which I'd inherited from my role at the IDC, interacting side by side with the white monopoly capital. Vishnu was engrossed in the governance, transparency, and accountability of the modern day corporation. He was interested in the executive management and directors as individuals to understand who they are, where did they study, and what is their relationship, and of course, their politics. Vishnu's work on the transformation of the academy continues. Vishnu and I had plans to co-supervise Black South African students, as we believe that it is them who should be telling us their stories. Whereas Vishnu was engrossed in Keynes' post-Keynesianism, political economy and inequality, amongst others, he was very supportive of my work on the evolution of the Black elite that has shaped the intersection of patronage and factionalism. Just yesterday evening, speaking at the 45th conference of the Black Management Forum, President Ramaphosa accused us that we have falsely and without evidence said that, or argued that preferential procurement policies, employment equity, and PE are responsible for the acts of corruption, thieving, bribery, and looting that we all see in South Africa today. Vishnu would have sent me last night a message asking me, please, to forward my PhD thesis to the president. On a lighter note, colleagues and professors, speaking of President Ramaphosa, there is a saying in South African popular culture among the Black elite that wonke umuntu une India lakhe. That is interpreted as every Black South African has his own Indian. This popular Black elite talk goes on further to say Mandela had Ahmed Kathrada, Mbeki had the Aesop brothers, Zuma the Gupta brothers, Ramaphosa Pravin Gordhan, and Lumkile Mondi Mahavishnu Padayachee. To quote again one of Fleetwood Mac's song that Vishnu could remember, don't stop thinking about tomorrow. Don't stop, it will soon be here. It will be better than before. Vishnu is gone. Vishnu is gone. Hamba kahle, Professor Padayachee. We have picked the spear.
Thank you, Lumkile, for those testifying words to Vishnu's, in the end, revolutionary essence. A second recently minted doctoral student of Vishnu's is Bradley Borders. They shared a passionate academic interest in post-Keynesian economics and its contemporary relevance for South African heterodox economics. Bradley.
Thank you, Robbie. And Robbie and I share a great love of Paul Robeson, which is just by the way, that's a separate thing. I had finished my honors in economics through UNISA, and I live in Cape Town, so I phoned UCT and said I would like to do a master's. I explained to them that I'm interested in Keynes, and particularly a left Keynesian, a sort of post-Keynesian position. I explained to them that I'm interested in history, the history of economic thought. And the supervisor that I was allocated was a neoclassical scholar who was not interested in history. So I just left it. I went to a couple of consultations and then I just left it. And then the years went by and I was in Durban and I love secondhand bookstores, and I stumbled upon Ike's books, and I'd never in my life before or afterwards seen such a incredible Keynesian and Marxist section in a secondhand bookstore. And so Joe was at the front desk, and I said, "Darling, this is incredible. I've never seen anything like this before." I said, "Where does it come from?" So she said, "It's thanks to the co-owner of the business, Professor Padayachee." So I said, "Darling, get him on the phone immediately. I want to take him for breakfast." And so I did. Vishnu, I complimented on the books. I explained that I was an aspirant master's student, and we met for breakfast. And during the breakfast, he explained we were talking about the clash which Adam Habib mentioned, the clash between ideas and power, how beautiful ideas have such difficulty in translating into policy when they butt up against power. And he was telling me about his experience in Merg, and he was telling me about how Ben Fine had been treated in the press as some sort of crazy person from business journalists who literally barely had economics 101, and then how his great disappointment that Gear eventually trumped the Merg policy, and at the end of that breakfast, we agreed that he said he offered to supervise my master's on the conflict between ideas and politics. I decided to focus on the interwar period because of the financial chaos then compared to now. I thought there were some parallels, and so started our supervision, and he was the most incredible supervisor. Others have mentioned how, I mean, I would write for months. I would write pages and pages and pages for months and submit it to him as a draft in the afternoon. And 7 o'clock the following morning, I'd have a detailed a response, a detailed critique of the work. And then we shared a sort of love of Keynes and also a revulsion of Benthamite calculus. I mean, to some extent, all economists, whether they're Marxists or Keynesians or neoclassicals, are to some extent interested in Benthamite calculus. It is about the allocation of resources. But with Vishnu, it was always the allocation of resources was just the starting point. It was just to get to a point of where human souls could thrive. And it was the human souls that Vishnu was really interested in. I mean, when he talked about Ben Fine, he didn't just describe a great academic. He also he would tell me about what a great soul this man has, that he was like a Lord Byron. I remember the metaphor he used. He's like a Lord Byron, he said to me. And the last paper that we were working on was a paper inspired by Jeff Mann's book on Keynes, on how policy and institutions must serve civilization. And we were debating a kind of what does that mean in a South African context? How can we imagine a sort of progressive African civilization that needs supporting? And I want to end by quoting something that could have been written by Keynes from Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren, where he talks about how if we get policy right, we can allocate resources in a way where human needs can be taken care of. He says, I therefore see us free to return to some of the most sure and certain principles of religion and traditional virtue, that avarice is a vice, that the exaction of usury is a misdemeanor, and the love of money is detestable, that those walk most truly in the paths of virtue and sane wisdom who take least thought for the morrow. We shall once more value ends above means and prefer the good to the useful. We shall honor those who can teach us how to pluck the hour and the day virtuously and well, the delightful people who are capable of taking direct enjoyment in things. The lilies of the fields who toil not, neither do they spin. Farewell, Vishnu.
Thank you. Thank you, Bradley, for those words. As may be well known, Vishnu took a very concerted interest in corporate governance and ensuring that understandings of governance, and then particularly the execution of governance, stood up to the highest possible ethics. And of course, he was completely angered by the wholesale corruption that unfolded in our democratic country. We have Ushi Naidu with us, a friend of Vishnu's and a CEO of Cantlin Investment Managers, the board on which Vishnu served on, to share some of her thoughts and feelings about Vishnu in the time that he was a member of the board and as a friend. Ushi.
Good evening, friends and family of Vishnu. Thank you, Robbie and Imran, for giving me this opportunity to pay tribute to Vishnu. I met Vishnu in 1999 at Deloitte when I was his wealth manager. And although it was a professional relationship, I was fascinated with Vishnu's ideas on economy and just his thoughts on everything. And when we started our own business in 2005, I invited him to sit on our board. And what Vishnu was able to do was when the company started, we didn't have huge resources. So he said to me, as long as you can provide a great bottle of wine and the best food, I will sit on your board for that. And we made sure we always had great wine and good food for him and the other board members, Gavin Brown and Paul Cantor. I think the presentation by Vishnu was what they most look forward to. He would fascinate them with his ideas and thoughts of the world and how we could incorporate those ideas into business. Vishnu became a friend and a confidant, and I his confidant. He shared a lot of the world and the ideas that we could incorporate into business. It became the business advisor, but he also added another dimension for the clients. He would often bring to the company a box of books, and he would say to them, please share this with the clients. Here's an invoice. You pick the books that the clients want, and if they want to pay for it, they can. And the clients were always delighted. Vishnu wrote the quarterly report and economic review, and our clients look forward to hearing from him. Hearing about what he thought of South Africa, particularly in the last few years, and how we could look for a better South Africa and a better home to our people. Vishnu gave me great advice as a business advisor and as a friend. He mentioned, I look at all your names and I listen to you speak, and he's spoken about so many of you. It feels like I almost know you. And he loved his friends, he loved his family, he loved the academic world. When I spoke to him, Vishnu made sure that we always thought we had everything available to strive for the best. He gave me support and courage when I was very frightened in this business world as a woman. And he helped me feel that everything and anything was achievable. And he did it with kindness. And there's a story I'd share quickly. When I met him at Lupa once for lunch with other members of the board, he was looking through a book, and Vishnu happened upon this picture of waiters, Indian waiters, and he looked at me, and there were tears in his eyes, and he said, "Do you know the price that was paid before your generation, Yushi?" And I looked at him and I thought, my God, this man is really passionate about changing South Africa, and it goes deep. And I would not forget the kindness he always showed to the staff and all the people that Vishnu came across. When I spoke to him last week on Thursday, we were planning, Satya and his cousins were planning a visit for him to Amkumas with his mom, and I was to see him on the Monday. And he said to me, Yushi, I think this is going to be my last birthday. And he sounded good on Thursday. And I said to him, Vishnu, you're talking nonsense, look positively. And on Friday, he didn't sound so grand. And, I just thought he's going to be okay. It feels like Vishnu was taken away sooner, but I know that the last few months, he has had a freedom to express himself and enjoy life. I had lunch with him at, I think it's called Spiga, opposite Mitchell Park. And Vishnu spoke about this being one of the best parts of Durban for his family. He spoke about Sonali when she was a little girl and how she played in the park and the laughter of their family. And he said he was happy just thinking back on those things. And I'd like to say, especially to Sonali, today, that your dad, if she ever listens to this, was a great supporter of women. And I hope and I know that you will follow one day in the footsteps of all the people that he's mentored. Farewell, my dear friend Vishnu. We love you. I feel like you were taken away too soon. But be that as it may, thank you for all that you have done. I will ever be grateful and try to continue the legacy that you've given us. Thank you. Thanks, Imran and Robbie.
Thanks so much, Vicky. Thanks so much. We're moving to the steady conclusion of our program. We're very fortunate that Eddie Webster is with us to share some thoughts and observations on Vishnu. Eddie is the Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Wits University, based in the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, a friend, comrade, an intellectual co-partner of Vishnu's on a number of shared academic projects at Wits University. Eddie had a number of close verbal and written conversations with Vishnu, amongst other, on the democratization of the workplace and the role of intellectuals in the current era of political crisis, up until Vishnu's tragic passing. Eddie.
Thank you, colleagues, friends. It's a great privilege to be part of this celebration of the life of my friend and colleague, Vishnu Padayachee. In paying tribute to Professor Padayachee and being the second last person to bat on this wicket, I want to make two brief points. Firstly, many of you have mentioned Vishnu's love of books and the famous Ike's bookshop in Durban. I want to mention an aspect of his love of books that has been neglected. Vishnu was an inveterate reviewer of books. The reviewing of books carries no currency in the academic world. It's a bit like the Zimbabwean dollar. It has no exchange value. It is routinely rejected by academic bureaucrats as unimportant and shunted to the task at the tail end of the academic's work. But Vishnu's passion for reviewing books as an indication of his commitment to a culture of critical reading and reflection. For him, a book review was an opportunity to explore the world of ideas and our place within it, as Ben Fine and John Sender have so articulately argued. Let me illustrate by reading the opening sentences of the review of a book on the modern corporation to be published later this year in the Australian journal, the Economic and Labour Relations Review. I quote, "On a Friday afternoon in August each year, we used to gather at our grandfather's ashram temple in the small town of Umkomaas on the south coast of Natal, South Africa. We were part of the small Indian indentured community brought to this part of the British Empire from southern India to work the sugar fields from 1860 to about 1911. Our family, led by my great-grandfather, arrived in 1882 and were assigned to the notorious Reynolds Brothers estate on the south coast," unquote. So begins Vishnu's review of a book on the modern corporation. It's the start of a long conversation that places the corporation in the context of the economic history of Natal and his own family's roots in the system of indentured labor. I turn now to the second point. In an unfinished article that Vishnu, Robbie van Niekerk, and I had begun to write when Vishnu prematurely passed away, when we were exploring the trajectory of intellectual life in South Africa from the 1960s to now. Looking back, we wanted to explore among anti-apartheid progressive scholars the distinct shift from trenchant critique of racial capitalism to policy work for the new democracy. A degree of doubt had begun to color our work. What were we hoping to achieve through our scholarship? In whose service were we working? In Vishnu's words, and I quote, "That mood grew into utter and desperate despair under Zuma, and deep confusion and outright anger as we emerge after Zuma into an era of debilitating and nihilistic factional politics within the ruling party," unquote. We had only begun to write the paper. It remains incomplete. It seems to me that the best way of paying tribute to Vishnu, for his friends, colleagues, and comrades, take forward this conversation, to search for spaces of hope in these uncertain times. Farewell, dear friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. We've closing now and ending our program, and Imran will close the program today. We've had a series of thoughtful and heartfelt tributes expressed here and also in the written media. I think perhaps myself, I'm possibly too grief-stricken yet to fully meditate on the meaning of Vishnu as a very dearest of friends and a brother of wise counsel in matters personal and professional. And I was looking for, in thinking of a tribute to him that we had on Monday in Durban at Maynard's firm, what made sense. And I went through Tagore, I went through Ingrid Jonker. It was a shared love of Vishnu and myself, the work of Ingrid Jonker. It was a running joke we had about who would be the first to find a signed copy of her edition. And we had much fun in dusty bookshops looking for that first edition that eluded us. I know Vishnu is somewhere up above and speaking to Ingrid Jonker and say, you know, Ingrid, I've got this mate, Robbie, he goes on all the time about you. And enjoy that glass, Vishnu, with Ingrid Jonker. But curiously, I found, and this is what I want to say, someone curiously, not perhaps self-evidently someone that Vishnu would be personified by. But I know he'd love and relish the connection with the Sturm and Drang of a swashbuckling revolutionary hero. And that was in fact the Argentinian Cuban Ernesto Che Guevara. And this is what I want to share today, and a longer meditation will be coming. Is this quote that I think for me so completely personifies all elements of Vishnu's being. And the quote goes something like this: at the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. It is impossible to think of a genuine revolutionary lacking this quality. And that's Vishnu for me. So we would like to thank Imran Valodia, economist, scholar, and dean of the Faculty of Commerce, Law and Management, and colleagues in his office, for organizing this memorial event in honor of Vishnu. It's fitting that Imran shares his observations and closes this formal memorial event in honor of Vishnu on behalf of Wits University. And I want to thank everyone for attending. I know it's already, we've hit already 6:10. We could go on and on for many hours into the night, for which we need perhaps more glasses of wine. And yes, just to pay tribute to this very, very, very beautiful man, Vishnu Padayachee. Imran, thank you.
Thank you so much, Robbie. And I'd like to just share three thoughts about Vishnu that will forever stay with me before I close. The first relates to Vishnu's role as an economics teacher, something that he and I shared for a long time. So he would have rejected with contempt the kind of argument that's often made by neoclassical economists, that because of their preoccupation with mathematics and their preoccupation with methodology, that somehow neoclassical economics was much more kind of rigorous than many other branches of economics that have endured for a lot longer than neoclassical economics. And that's something that he lived by. But he also lived strongly by and would have rejected with contempt kind of any attempt by people who teach heterodox economics to not provide their students with kind of all of the rigor that goes with an economics training. In the many years that I shared teaching economics with him and being taught economics by him. And many of our students in development studies at UK and from Wits who are here with us today will bear testimony to the fact that an economics course that Vishnu taught kind of had all of the rigor of kind of to read all of the classics of kind of having to understand Adam Smith, of having to read Keynes, and of being competent enough to deal with all of the technical issues that are part of part of an economics training, and that's something that will stay with me forever. The kind of second remark I wanted to make was kind of really about the kind of enormous impact of the work that is done. It is something that will last forever, and we will forever be able to read the kind of enormous kind of amount of work that is done, but also the enormous range of the work that is done. But I think really for me the kind of two key things that I take about his work is the incredible efficiency with which he worked. Many of you have remarked about the kind of emails you'd received from him. Kind of every paper that he wrote, that I saw him write, was done with the most incredible efficiency. But it was also done with a huge amount of generosity. Most of the work that is done is work that is done jointly. Is work that is done with his students. And I think the lessons for how he worked is something that will stay with me forever. The third remark I wanted to make was something about the praxis that Julian spoke about. He was a firm kind of believer in the need for us to take the university into the policy world, but making that step throws up a whole kind of set of moral and kind of ethical dilemmas that we have to deal with, and they really revolve around how we deal with those in power, and what we as academics and kind of intellectual say to them, and what the principles are with the way we say it. Vishnu had kind of had his seat kind of in that power. And those of us who know him well know how much he loved being in that seat. But the lesson that I always took from him, and I think we will all continue to take, is no matter how tempting that power is, and no matter how rewarding it is to be at that table, Vishnu was absolutely unstinting in maintaining his independence and putting across the views that he felt were the ones that were the right ones to put across. All of his work from work onwards matters that those in power did not want to hear. But in all of the years I knew him, he never once compromised on that. And for me, that's a key lesson in the way that he did his work, and in the way that he lived his life. Before I close, I'd like to just thank you all for being a part of the celebration of his life. I'd like to thank the speakers, those of you who shared photographs and searched high and low for the photographs that we needed. I want to thank my colleagues at Wits, especially the kind of events team that have been led by Michelle, that made everything happen so efficiently. I want to thank Sharona and her communications team for the fantastic work that they did to support us today. I'd like to thank David Francis, who took care of all of the technical issues to make this event work so well. I'd like to thank Kim Jurgensen in my office, who made sure that everything happened that everything happened exactly as I wanted it to happen. The kind of only regret that I have of the event today is that Vishnu is not here to share it with us. He would have loved all of the tributes, and he would have loved all of the praises that we've sung of him. He would have loved all of the comments about the importance of his work. He has left us, and he has left us sooner than he should have. But I think we will always have his memories. We will always have his work. And we will always have the fantastic role model that he was to all of us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Goodbye, Vishnu. Go well, our great friend.
Yeah.